Well, the first thing I saw in Milton Shapp, from my standpoint as a reporter, and I was a young reporter at the time I met him, was he was a very fine news source. He would give you the answers to the questions you had. He was straightforward, he was honest, he was approachable. There are many, many people that I have had to deal with in these 50 years that I've been a reporter who are afraid to talk to you, or are arrogant, or are ignorant. Milton was none of those. I became interested in cable television, which we called at the time community television, because I had grown up on a farm in Ohio. We had no electricity, so we tried battery radios. This was in the 30s. A battery radio, those of you who were around at the time probably know, did not last very long, and you could not afford to keep furnishing batteries for that. And as a kid, I absolutely was devastated to be listening to KDKA Pittsburgh, the Sherlock Holmes, and it would fade out, the batteries would die. And so as a kid reporter, when I came to Washington in 1945, and covering a glamorous city and this glamorous new industry of television, and I had never seen television before 1945, I still had my childhood memories of radio that I couldn't get. And when cable came along and it brought it to the people in the valleys and in the distances where they could not get television, I frankly empathized with them enormously. It was a really nothing kind of business. When it first started, it was really peanuts. We were covering the networks, we were covering the manufacturers, we were covering the big, big business of television. Cable was genuinely nothing, but I sympathized with it. And I got to know Milt because he was approachable and he was doing something about the field in which I was interested. And I began to report what he was doing, and I could talk to him, I could reach him. And I could reach his people and talk to them. He made them available. And he became a very good personal friend. He was still very new at the business when he would come to Washington. And he would stay at our house occasionally. And one of the things that Zal did not mention, that should be mentioned about Milt, is his enormous energy. It was enormous. Give you the example. Stayed at our house one night. He and I sat up talking till 5 o'clock in the morning. And I was exhausted and went to bed. When I got up the next morning, Peg told me that at 7 o'clock, 2 hours later, after we went to bed, our son Dan, who was 2 years old at the time, he's now 42, went into Milt's room and sat on his chest and looked him in the eye and says, "Who are you, mister?" And Milt played with him, laughed with him, talked with him. I could no more do that after 2 hours sleep than fly. this is energy, and he expressed it in every other way. This is one of the most important things about genius. Energy. He had it on top of all other things. And he was one hell of a good PR man. He knew how to talk to reporters. The way to talk to reporters is to tell them the truth, and when it isn't useful to you to tell them the truth, I can't talk about it. Just tell them. The reporter expects that. Those are some of the things about Milt. Thank you.
I too can attest to Milt's energy because most of it was focused on rewriting what I'd written. Milton named his company by his middle name, Jerrold, because, quote, I have always been in the middle of things, and so has my company. John Regas named his company Adelphia, a Greek word for brothers, because he and his brother Gus acquired a cable franchise in their hometown of Wellsville, New York. John, the name of your company should now be changed from Adelphia to Patsia, which means sons in Greek, because John's 3 sons now help John run the 1.5 million subscriber company spread over 11 states. John is a perpetual optimist, risk-taker, and a good friend. That's why he has always reminded me of Milton Shapp. John?
Well, that's quite a compliment, Dan. Thank you very much. Muriel, it's nice to see you, and to all your distinguished guests here on the panel. I'm really honored to be here tonight. I think I'd like to just focus on the early years and what Milton Shapp meant to so many of us. When I think back that I was in this little community, population 2,800 people, and Milton Shapp came to, what was it, Cartersport, Pennsylvania, along with Fred Lieberman, and they wanted to introduce us to Jerrold Equipment, 1952. And in the discussion, Jerrold was introducing equipment, and they had a competitor by Entron, and we weren't sure which way to go. But because of Milt's, I think, honesty and integrity that came across, and that infectious smile, that if any of you had met him, you couldn't help but just be taken in by his personality and his knowledge. So we went with Jerrold. And in that discussion, Milt would say, well, he says, I think you ought to charge $150 to hook up. And why would you charge $150 to make a connection? Well, he says, I think we're going to be around, but I'm not sure. So we better get the money up front. And I thought that was good advice. And we charged $2.75 a month. We promised 3 clear pitchers. We gave them 2 snowy ones. Remember those? And we struggled and we struggled. But the bottom line is that when you talk about compassion, and there was no resources or places to borrow money, Milton Shapp, and he was struggling in his own way in the early days, would take a note, and the big trick was, and Milt would say, John, he says, don't you ever return those notes signed? And I'd say, well, not if I can help it, Milt. And so his credit manager and side promenades would call me up and call up my brother and try to deal with that note, and it would build bigger and longer and drag on. And finally, I got the big call. Mr. Shapp. He says, John, he says, I kind of like those hot dogs in your dad's restaurant. He says, I'm coming up for a hot dog. So he came to Wellsville and brought out the note. We signed it. But I don't know how many people in this industry wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Milton Shapp and his understanding, compassion, and along with that risk-taking that he took not only for his business to build it up, but he extended that one extra dimension and trusted us and believed in us and never pressured us to make those payments. And that lasted for a lot of years. And I'm one that can testify and without any reservation say that if it wasn't for Milt and that extension of believing in me and understand me and believing in the industry, I wouldn't be here today as part of this industry because we just didn't have anything to begin with. And one interesting story is that later on, Milt was interested in buying our system in Wellsville. And he kept trying to make appointments, and we kept missing it. And one day, my brother said, well, Mr. Shapp's going to call us up, and he wants to talk about selling the system. And fine, and we're not too formal. And my brother Gus was working the grill, and I was standing next to him, and the phone rang, and Milt was on, and he started to say, John, he says, we're interested in buying your system. In the background, you could hear one hot beef sandwich, 2 cheeseburgers, and through this discussion, he's trying to make a deal. And my brother is trying to answer him, but at the same time, to order French fries ready. And pretty soon Milt says, what's going on down there? Where are you guys? Well, we're in a restaurant. And my brother Gus was kind of kidding. He says, well, we got to make a living, Milt. You know. And so Milt says, you don't want to sell your systems. You know, we'll talk some other time. I thought that was pretty humorous. And we really didn't want to sell our system. I'm terrible about selling the system. One other time, he had a great sense of humor. And he'd been elected governor, and I was president of the state association, and we decided to honor Milt. And we had this wonderful banquet in Harrisburg, and Muriel and Milt were there, and he honored us. And I had the privilege of introducing Milt. As part of my introduction, I began by saying that I've been looking for Milt for a long, long time. And like he used to look for me to get a note signed, I've been searching for him because I have a problem. Then I reached down and I brought out the 2 oldest pieces of equipment that Jerrold ever had, the first ones he ever made, and I said, Milt, I paid you for these, they didn't work, and what are you going to do about it? And Milt said, Johnny, he looked at him, he says, they're out of warranty. So he was quick and smarter than I was. Throughout all this, yes, he was compassionate, understanding, but he was a real leader. And when the discussion was made about what had happened with that bill, I remember it so well, because I was just struggling like so many of us, and every word and every piece of encouragement that I read about what Milt had to say just kept me in the business. Because I will tell you, many, many times I would attend Pennsylvania Association meetings, meet with everybody. Everything could be pretty bleak because we were fighting the telephone companies, the theater operators, the broadcasters, the TV repairmen, and all over. And we didn't know where we were going to be, and there was no certainty what a franchise was worth or wasn't. But Milt was truly an optimist and a visionary. And so just every time he would speak and you would see him, he would just buoy you up and kept me in this business. There was a few others, but Milt was certainly one. And that day that they were going to vote on the Senate to regulate the industry, and it was a done deal, and for whatever reason, Mr. Shapp said, I don't like it, and he sent out telegrams to rural America, to all these little operators. Didn't know what it was all about, but I got that telegram, said, you got to come to Washington. I couldn't afford the trip, but I went to Washington. We appeared on that floor, defeated that bill, and it wouldn't have happened. It was one of the most unusual events that ever happened on the floors of Congress. And Milt had that kind of influence. So when it's all said and done, I guess the years have gone by, and the industry perhaps has not really appreciated, and I understand times have changed, and we've been in a different era, but if there was a father in this industry, Milt Shapp was it. Thank you.
John, that was just beautiful, very moving. She was one of the few people who never called Milton by his first name. She called him Mr. Shapp until he was governor, and after that she always called him governor. She and her father, George Barco, directed the course of cable television in Pennsylvania, and through NCTA, its national presence. They were close friends of the governor, and I speak, of course, of Yolanda Barco, a woman much admired by Milt and much admired by Muriel. The days is yours.
Muriel, fellow pioneers, friends, I don't know why, Dan, you didn't ask me a question.
I'll tell you, there are no answers left to give.
Well, I'll have to make the question and make the answer. Everybody has said so much. I don't really have a great deal more to say. But I want to mention three different things that are kind of unrelated, and I want to finish up enlarging somewhat on what John Regas was saying to us. First of all, many of you know that my father was in cable mostly because he wanted to see television. He was the consumer among us, and he was one of the few cable people I know that actually liked to watch television. I could tell you stories about what it was to work with my father because he was the most demanding subscriber we had, and he was the most appreciative. But his getting to know Mr. Shapp started with his interest back in 1951 to see television, And he wanted it himself, and he used to say, I'd like our community to have the benefit of it too. So he spent a year trying to get information from RCA. And he badgered these people, and they weren't really interested in doing this kind of work. And finally, someone sent him to Jerrold. And I will never forget, Muriel, the day that he came back. And I thought he would talk about, you know, finding somebody to do what he was so interested in. But he said instead, I have met the most wonderful man. I am inspired by the way this man works. You should see his plant. You should see the people that he has there. People from all kinds of background, disabled people, people of all types and sorts. And he has them working beautifully together. He's an inspiration. My father saw the goodness of Milton Shapp and all of the other things he had, but his goodness was what my father loved the most. Now, I want to say there are many, many anecdotes I could tell you about that relationship, but let me say, Zoll, you're not the only one that bridged the gap between cable and his political activities. Because when he ran for governor, my father, you know, we come from Crawford County, hidebound Republicans, and Ray Schaefer, who was running against Milt in this particular election, was from our county. And Milt, I believe, I know he made a number of appearances, and I think maybe he even opened his campaign in Crawford County. But we came out full tilt in Crawford County for Milton Shapp, and the governor used the expression in his campaign in our region of the country, those who know Ray Schaefer and Milton Shapp the best prefer Milton Shapp. You know, you hear that in your own territory, and it takes something, but we were delighted to do it. I want to take us all back. Most of us were there back then. But I wanted to remind you just briefly of the fact that back in 1952, when we first met Milton Shapp, most of us in the cable industry were quite young. Milt at that time was 40. Bob Tarleton was 38. John Walson was 38. The Ganses and, well, not young Gans, but Joe and John and I were in our 20s. And most people in the industry were younger than let's say, Mr. Shapp and the others that I've mentioned. People were about the young 30s. It was a young group of people in the industry. And if you were in cable, you had to have a big streak of being irrational. There's no question about it. There was no reason to stay in this business. Because number one, you didn't know if you had the right to be in the rights of way. Number two, there was very difficult to get pole attachment agreements, and every single one of them said you had to get off on 6 months' notice. Would anybody in their right mind put thousands of miles and thousands of dollars into a plant that you could get off of in 33 months' notice or 6 months' notice? We didn't know about the legal basis for what we were doing. Our public had an ambivalent idea about us. They wanted the pictures, but they resented paying for it because they somehow thought this was something extra they shouldn't have to do. So, but still, ladies and gentlemen, you all who were there know that there was a tremendous appeal, that you couldn't stay away from it. Now, into all of this uncertainty, with a lot of small entrepreneurs who didn't have much. And by the way, the technology was also something of a mystery. because I would say we did a lot of do-it-yourself, and it was like a young golfer learning a golf stroke. When it worked, you didn't really know why, and it was always uncertainty. Now, into this environment, with all of this interest and all of this commitment that so many of us had, the unifying force was Milton Shapp. There's no question that he gave us all what we needed. Somebody with optimism, somebody with direction, somebody that we knew was going to carry the technology somewhere. And beyond all this, if you recall, the industry was structured so far as beginning to get pole attachment agreements, and also the setting up of the business entities themselves. We followed what he would do in these respects. So I want you to know that, to my way of thinking, he was what put us all together and what made us effective and in coming to where we are today. I want to say finally that I've often wondered where this industry would be today if the governor had decided to stay with it, and I'm sure we would be much farther along than we are, but we'll still get there. Thank you, everyone.
I would now like to call on the last member of this panel. It was in 1947 that the first story on cable television, or community antenna, appeared in a national publication. It was the Wall Street Journal that had the following headline. And I can still see it, I think. Christmas comes to Lansford, Pennsylvania in July. And the story then went on to tell how a cable television system had been constructed in Lansford, had been demonstrated downtown, and thousands of people came out to see the demonstration. It was really a shopping day like only Christmas had had until then. The owner of that system, the guy who thought it up and put it all together, was Bob Talton. Bob is indeed one of the pioneers in this industry, and I'd like to come up to the podium, Bob.
Thank you, Dan. I made a few notes here, and I'd like to refer to them. I've often heard Milt referred to as being a visionary, and I'd like to respectfully correct that because according to the dictionary, a visionary fundamentally is someone who has idealistic goals and aims incapable of realization. However, I know and admired Milt as a visional. He had great vision, great insight, a vivid imagination, and realistic goals. And I just digress for a moment because I heard some comments here about Milt's ability to really move on. Muriel will certainly attest to the many times he would get up during the middle of the night out of bed and put down notes that he was thinking about in bed. And many of his thoughts were from those notes that he had accumulated during bed. I will tell you one other note too, forgive me for nostalgia, but I joined Milt in 1952. He told me to come out to the engineering meeting in New York City, the 1st of February 1952, meet him there. And I went up and he said, geez, Bob, you can't get any room here in the hotel, so we'll get a bed in here and bunk with Hank Arbeiter and me. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, everybody left, and Milt said, I thought, well, I'm tired, I hope I can get some sleep. And Milt said, now we can talk, Bob. And we laid in bed, we started to talk, and I didn't know, but I fell asleep on him. Hank Arbeiter told me a year later, Bob, you're the first person that ever shut Milt up. But not boastfully, but I consider it my privilege to have known Milt, and also possibly have known Milt longer than anybody here this evening except my dear friend Muriel. Some may not know the background, and I would like to take some license for a few minutes to explain to what I refer. My friendship with Milt before television and cable. I operated a television or radio repair shop prior to, well, from about 1934 on with my father. I went into service in 1943 and out in 1945, and went back in with my father in the electronic repair business. And during World War II, I was in military service as a radio repairman attached to the field artillery unit in Italy. And incidentally, although I didn't know him at the time, didn't know Milt, who was a captain attached to a radio broadcast group in Italy at the same time. But when I returned from service, I again joined my father and had the pleasure of meeting Milt a couple of times when he'd visit my shop with, as a manufacturer's representative with distributors. Milt began his career as a manufacturer's representative, and I hadn't any contact for some time with Milt a year or two after that until I received a phone call in the fall of 1950 to arrange an appointment with him the day before Thanksgiving 1950, when Milt, Muriel, baby Richard, and baby Joanne came up and spent from lunch until late in the evening with me. What I had been doing was using his apartment house amplifiers for about 6 or 8 months. I was buying them from distributors in the area, and I finally thought, while I was buying so many, I'd go to Philadelphia and buy them direct. And Muriel, I think you remember Bud Green, and that name's Bud Green was his sales manager and chief foreman. And saw Bud Green, oh sure, we'll sell you amplifiers. And I modified the amplifiers to a bit because they were designed specifically only for picture quality. Sound was down, and I did a bit of modifications on them, a little retuning, and got them to work. And one day when I was down for another batch of amplifiers, Bud Green asked, what are you doing with those things? And I said, well, I told him what I was doing with them, put them into a master antenna that's building it in a town. Oh, he said, these weren't made for that. I said, I know they weren't, but I'm modifying. Oh, he said, well, I had to get a release. He said, I can't sell you any more unless you sign a release. I had no problem at all. I signed a release and went on up, and that's when Milt, I guess, got heard about it, and he wanted to see what I was doing. And before leaving that day to go back home, the day before Thanksgiving of 1950, he said, Bob, you got an idea here. He said, I'm going to challenge my engineering group to start building equipment that will do what you want to be done. And will you join me? I said, what do you mean? He said, I could hire you. I said, Milt, I got the $500, only $500 that I had, and I got 5 other service organizations to put some money in. I went to the bank and got $20,000. I said, I can't leave them here with this. Well, he said, will you work with us? And I had a very excellent relationship through Milt's suggestion for about 2 years, where he would have the engineering group build something, send it up, critique it. I'd make my comments, either had some problems or not, and send it back until just at the beginning of 1952, Milt called me. He said, Bob, I want to come down. I want to talk to you. So I went down, and he said, I got a problem. He said, I've just sold a master antenna, or a community antenna system to a capital group, venture capital group in in New York City, and that's Williamsport. He said it'll be the Williamsport one-step television. We'll put it in there, and this was his first venture into doing the work himself and then getting venture capital. He said, "I'd like you to join us." And I didn't give it too much thought. I didn't have to give it too much thought because my son was graduating from high school that year, and he wanted to go to college in Philadelphia. I thought it was a great opportunity. So I said, "Sure, I'll come down," because my system was going along great, and I had some good people. And although I continued ownership for years in it, I joined Milt, and for the next 8 or 9 years, I traveled all over the country putting in systems for Milt. And that was a relationship that I enjoyed with Milt over the years. And first system I ever built for him was in Williamsport. And the last system I built was in Dubuque, Iowa. It took the span of close to 9 years. And when I left, after finishing Dubuque, Iowa, he said, "Well, now, Bob, I got an idea." I had put a system in Ventnor, New Jersey. And I joined Jerrold as chief field engineer and left as a vice president of community operations. All of these various systems that we were responsible to capital groups for came through my desk. And that he said, "I have an idea." He said, "Ventnor's a small system, but it's close by. Why don't you take and kind of get lost for a year down there and see if you can't have something to do with experimenting with pay TV." Remember, this was back about 1956, 58, 59, 60, and the Bartlesville had been only an attempt, and I'm embarrassed. I'm trying to think of our good friend who followed the Bartlesville system, but he had an accident, and it was a failure, possibly because of him not being able to continue it. But he said, "Go down there, and I think that this is a possibility." And I said, "That's a challenge, Milt, and I would like to do it, but I think that, at this point in time, I've been away from home for a good many years, traveling all over, and I think that I'll have to refuse it." I did leave Jerrold and continued to do consulting work independently for myself, and still owned for a number of years the system in Lansford. But I do think that I only wanted to call to attention Milt's visionary respects and all. Thank you.
I don't want anyone to take more time at this podium than it took to read my introduction. Before I call on Muriel Shapp, is there anyone here who would like to add anything? Who has any sense about Milton that was not covered here tonight? I think it was a bittersweet evening. And before it ends, I would like to call on Muriel.
Stand here without falling down. I cannot tell you how much I have valued all of the things I've heard from all of you this evening, how very meaningful it has been to me to be here, to be with some old and dear friends whom I haven't seen in a long time. It's just been very special, and so I really owe you, Dan, a very special vote of thanks, because if it had not been for your idea and your suggestion, I wouldn't be here tonight, and I'll never forget this. There are a couple of things I thought I would share with you, but first I want to say something that years ago when Milton was in office, I would travel around and make little speeches here and there, and the thing I always believed was this, it's my credo, that the mind cannot absorb any more than the seat can endure. So I won't have you enduring much more. But there are a couple of things I wanted to tell you that will fill in, since none of you chose to enter this Quaker meeting that Dan suggested. First of all, he was an interesting man, he truly was. Most of us, when we are in business, think of some business reason why we would like to go on a vacation somewhere. Milton always thought the other way, that he had always a business reason and maybe we could work in a little bit of vacation around it. And you can understand that I didn't like that very much, but we did a lot of traveling as a result, and I have him then to thank in absentia for introducing me to all of you. But I can remember crazy things, like we'd go through a town in northern Pennsylvania, and he would be counting junction boxes on all the telephone poles, you know, and that was very important to him. He couldn't understand why all of our relatives who would come with us didn't think this was very impressive. Other things he did. We used to go to a hotel much like this called Grossinger's, and he had persuaded these people in the Catskills to put up an antenna system there. And one cold winter day, we were there, and the manager of the place said it wasn't working very well. So off we went up the golf course, and damned if Milton didn't climb up this tower all the way up to fix the thing. I'm standing down at the bottom, furious, saying, I wish he breaks his neck, at the same time that I'm thinking, oh my God, what if he falls off? So you can understand I was a little bit ambivalent. But that was Milton. Now, another thing I'd like to tell you about that nobody mentioned here, and I'm surprised. We talk about interactive TV. Way back, what was it about? Sal, do you remember what year it was? 50 what? When he had Don Kirk and this gang build this whole batch of equipment that was going to serve as interactive TV. It didn't come off because he was well ahead of his time. We're now talking about it and doing it. But there he was way back then. Now, what was the other thing I want to tell you about? This is the end, really, of what I want to tell you about. That he was a Renaissance man. He wrote music, he wrote plays, he wrote limericks. He used to tell the most marvelous bedtime stories to the kids every Sunday morning. I think I liked him better than the kids did. I couldn't wait for the next episode. But one of the things he did was write lots of music. And each piece of music that he wrote said something about something he felt very deeply about. And so I brought you one. And the incredible thing about this one was I was looking for it, and I went through zillions of old tapes and read the labels and couldn't find it. And all of a sudden, the last one I picked out, I looked at, and I thought, gee, maybe it's got it here. And I put it in this little machine and pressed the button, and don't you know, that was the first thing I heard from the machine, so then I knew I had to bring it here. Now, I don't know how well it's going to go, but bear with me, because it tells you something about what he believed. Now, if you're not going to work now, I'm going to hate you. You were working a few minutes ago. This thing was working like a there it goes. Can you hear it?
You've got to stand up, fight for the things you stand for, fight for the things you know are right. You've got to stand up, don't let them ever push you, fight for the things you know are true.
When you're facing opposition, but you're sure of your position, stop and analyze. For if principles involved at all, no issue will be solved at all if you compromise. So once you know you're right, be prepared to fight.
You've got to stand up, fight for the things you stand for, fight for the things you know are right. You got to stand up, decide what you really stand for, then back up your stand with all your might. If you want to survive, you got to stand up. To stay alive, you got to stand up. So understand what you stand for, then stand up. Yes,
one of you for a wonderful, wonderful evening. This tribute to Milton means more to me than any of you can know. Thank you. Good night, and God bless you.
Thank you all very much. I would like to ask all the panelists to remain here because we want to do a group photograph with Muriel. You might remember I started tonight by saying I'm privileged to be the president of PCTA. A couple of these people on this panel are former PCTA presidents, and gives you an idea as you listen to the sense of history why I consider this to be such a privilege to work with, in this position and, be associated with people of this caliber and this quality, and it's truly humbling and really an honor. I didn't come up during the Quaker meeting thing, but I do have a Milt Shapp story, even though I never met Milt Shapp. My first real job was for a public relations firm in Harrisburg called Anthony J. May and Associates. Muriel, I'm sure you know Tony May is Milt's former press secretary, and I was kind of relieved when you went through the description of Milt as a Renaissance man and in music and limericks and all those things. You didn't mention poetry, because I remember when Governor Shapp was in office, he did publish a book of poetry, and a special courier came down from the governor's office with a copy for Tony, and Tony went in his office and closed the door, and after a while he came back out and said, and these were poems, by the way, with titles like Christmas Eve in Tel Aviv. And I was glad you didn't mention poetry among those Renaissance man qualities, because Tony said, I read every one of these poems, and at the end I felt something was lacking, and it finally dawned on me what was missing: Burma shave. I left that position to work like Dan in public relations. I worked for a union representing the faculty at the state-owned colleges. We had an executive director named Marty Morand, and the faculty at the state-owned colleges had to negotiate with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for their raises. And Marty Morand carried with him a matchbook that was a Shapp campaign matchbook that called for free tuition at the state colleges. This was part of Milt's belief that everybody should have an opportunity for higher education, that your financial ability shouldn't be a restraint or a constraint on your ability to achieve. The guy I worked for happened to be from New York City, a product of the City Colleges of New York, which until recently had free tuition for anybody who could get there. They referred to it as the price of a subway ride would get you an education. And it's interesting that cable has evolved to be an industry so committed to education, and so it's so delightful that we have these ties and this continuity in this industry. That optimism that was mentioned by, I think, Ms. Barkow, that Milt had, I hope that part of what I bring to this job is that sense of optimism, because as we're looking to this building we're moving into, there was a decision made, we're not going to pay for this out of dues money. We created a foundation. We're going to pay for it with contributions. I'm optimistic we're going to raise the money, to make this building work. And though we promised Dan we wouldn't be pitching and hitting you all for funds tonight, I can assure you all you will be hit for funding in the near future. So. In closing, I would like to remind everybody that tomorrow we are recognizing the Cable Pioneers with our Founders Awards and a couple of special awards. And I would like to encourage you all to take advantage of the open bar and the hors d'oeuvres that are here courtesy of General Instrument and Cable Services. And thank you very much for everything this evening.